I'm 34, and last month I found out something about my family that's turned my whole life inside out. It started with a voicemail from a number I didn't recognize. An old, shaky voice saying my name like they'd been searching for me for years. The man claimed he was my father, which would be impossible because my father's been dead for over 2 decades. At first I assumed it was some scam, but there was something in the way he said my childhood nickname, one I hadn't heard since I was about 6, that froze me in place. He also mentioned a detail about the house I grew up in, the color of the swing set in our backyard, that nobody outside my immediate family could possibly know. I deleted the voicemail. I told myself it was too bizarre to be real. But later that night, I couldn't stop thinking about it. My mom had always been cagey about my dad's past, claiming he'd been a quiet, hard-working man who died young in a car accident. We had a closed casket funeral, and I was too little to really remember much about the whole thing. The next day, the same number called again. This time, I picked up. The man sounded like he'd been crying. He told me he'd been in prison for the last 28 years for a crime he swears he didn't commit. And then he dropped the part that made my stomach turn. He said my mom knew the truth the entire time. I hung up without saying a word, but my hands wouldn't stop shaking. That night, I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw flashes of my childhood, the faint smell of motor oil on my dad's jacket, the way my mom's face would tighten any time someone mentioned him, the fact that we never had any pictures of him around after the funeral. It was like she'd scrubbed him out of our lives. By morning, I couldn't stand it anymore. I called my mom. I told her about the calls. There was a long, heavy pause on the line, long enough for me to hear my own heartbeat in my ears, before she said in the flattest voice possible, "Don't talk to him again." No explanation. No, he's lying. Just an order. I pushed. I asked her if Dad's accident had really happened the way she'd always told me. She said yes, but there was this tiny catch in her voice when she said it, like she had to force the word out. I asked why there'd never been photos of him after, why we never visited his grave, why the funeral had been closed, casket. Her response? "You were too young to understand. I was protecting you." Protecting me from what? She wouldn't answer. She just told me again to stay away from that man, that he'd destroy what's left of our family. Then she hung up. That was all it took to make me do the exact opposite. If she was going to shut me out, I'd get the answers somewhere else. I called the number back. The man answered on the first ring, and the first thing he said was, "Your mother told me you'd never forgive me, but she never told you why, did she?" His voice was rough, the kind of voice that sounded like it had been weathered by years of shouting over machinery, or maybe shouting in desperation. He told me his name wasn't the one I'd grown up with. The man I'd called Dad had a different last name entirely, one my mother must have deliberately erased. I didn't interrupt, even when my hands itched to demand answers. He said he'd been a mechanic back then, working in a small garage on the edge of town. One night, a man was killed in a bar fight a few blocks away. The police claimed they had an eyewitness who'd seen my father there. He swore he'd been at home with my mom. I asked the question that had been burning in my mind since the first voicemail. If he was innocent, why didn't Mom testify for him? His silence was worse than any answer. Then, finally, he said, "Because she told them I wasn't home that." My stomach dropped. He went on, his voice breaking now, saying he thought she'd done it out of fear, maybe to protect herself from whatever was really going on. But then he told me something that made the room spin. He said he'd written me letters, dozens of them, birthday cards, Christmas notes, even drawings when I was little. Every single one had been sent to my mom's address, and I'd never seen a single one. I couldn't sit still. I was pacing my apartment, trying to connect pieces that had never fit before. He swore he had proof, copies of the letters, even a few Polaroids of me as a toddler that I'd never seen. Then he said the thing that made my skin crawl. "I'm not the only one your mother lied about." I froze mid-step. The way he said it, low, deliberate, made the hairs on my arms stand up. I asked him what he meant, but he didn't answer right away. I could hear papers shuffling on his end, like he was sifting through something. Then he told me that before he was arrested, he'd started suspecting my mom was seeing someone else. He never had proof, just little things. Late nights, unexplained errands, the way she suddenly had more money than usual. He thought it was paranoia until the day he saw her get into a car with a man he didn't recognize. He said he followed them to a motel. When I asked if he confronted her, he laughed bitterly. "No," he said. He went home, and that night was the night of the bar fight, the night he got arrested. He swears he wasn't anywhere near the bar, but the man she'd been with? He fit the description of the actual suspect almost perfectly. I could feel my pulse pounding in my neck. If he was telling the truth, it meant my mom might have let him take the fall to protect someone else. Then he asked me something I wasn't prepared for. Had I ever wondered why I don't look much? I tried to brush it off, but the truth was I had. People used to comment on it when I was younger, and my mom would laugh it off with, "She takes after my side of the family." But now, that excuse felt flimsy. Before I could say anything, he told me he'd had a DNA test done from an old toothbrush of mine he somehow still had from before his arrest. And the results? He wasn't my biological father. It felt like the air got sucked out of the room. My knees actually went weak, and I had to sit down. I barely knew this man, but I'd spent my whole life believing he was my father. Now he was telling me not only had my mom lied about how he ended up in prison, she'd lied about who I even was. I asked who my real father was, but he said he didn't know for sure. He had a name in mind, the same man he'd seen her with before his arrest, but he'd never been able to prove it. That man had moved out of state shortly after the trial, and as far as he knew, he'd lost touch. Then he said something, my skin crawled. I think she still talks to him. You might have even met him and not realized who he was. I racked my brain, thinking back to random family friends my mom introduced me to over the years. Those guys who'd show up for dinner once, and never again. None of them stood out, at least not enough to scream, "Secret Dad." He told me he could send me the letters, the photos, and the DNA results if I wanted them. He said I deserved to know the truth, even if my mom hated him. My stomach twisted, but I told him to send everything. After we hung up, I sat in silence for hours, staring at nothing. My phone buzzed a few times, texts from Mom asking if I was okay, but I couldn't bring myself to answer. I didn't know what to say to her, not until I saw whatever he was sending. 3 days later, a battered envelope showed up, and inside was proof that shattered everything. The envelope was thick, stuffed with papers and photographs that smelled faintly of dust and something metallic, like they'd been stored away for decades. On top was a stack of birthday cards in messy, oil-stained handwriting, some with stick-figure drawings of me holding hands with a man in a baseball cap. Every one of them had been addressed to our old house. The postmarks matched the years I would have been the right age for the drawings. Beneath the cards were Polaroids. Me as a toddler on a tricycle I barely remember, sitting on someone's shoulders at a county fair, blowing out candles on a cake shaped like a car. In each photo, the man holding me had the same tired brown eyes and crooked smile as the one I'd met through the phone. Then came the DNA, printed in bold clinical text. It confirmed what he'd said. We were not biologically. I was shaking so badly that I dropped and it slid under my coffee table. At the bottom of the envelope was a final item, a grainy, yellowed photograph of my mom, much younger, standing next to a man I didn't recognize. His arm was around her waist. She was smiling in a way I'd never seen in real life, her head tilted toward him like she belonged there. On the back, in faded blue ink, someone had written a name. It wasn't my supposed father's name, and when I typed it into Google, the first thing that came up was a mug. The mugshot was from the year before I was born. The man, tall, sharp-jawed, with the same storm-gray eyes staring back at me in reflection, had been arrested for aggravated assault. I clicked through the records, my pulse thudding in my ears, and saw he'd been in and out of trouble for years. Fights, theft, even a weapons charge. Digging deeper, I found an old newspaper article linking him to the same bar where my dad had supposedly been seen. The date matched perfect. My mind spun. Was this the man my mom had been protecting all along? If so, she'd let an innocent man, someone I now knew had raised me, at least for a while, rot in prison for something this stranger might have done. I couldn't stop staring at the mugshot. The resemblance between us was undeniable. Same chin, same deep crease between the brows. It was like looking at a harder, older version of myself. That night, I didn't sleep. I kept replaying every moment of my childhood where a family friend had stopped by, trying to figure out if this man had ever been there. But nothing clicked. Either he'd never been around, or my mom had been very good at keeping us apart. The next morning, I decided I couldn't sit with this any longer. I called my mom, told her we needed to meet in person. She tried to put it off, saying she was busy, but I pushed until she reluctantly agreed. We met at a quiet cafe on the edge of town, and the moment I slid the photograph across the table, her face drained of color. For a long moment, she just stared at the photograph like it was something toxic. Her fingers twitched toward it, then pulled back, like touching it might burn her. I watched her throat work as she swallowed hard, her eyes darting anywhere but mine. When she finally spoke, her voice was low and shaky. She asked me where I'd gotten it. I told her it didn't matter, that what mattered was whether the man in that picture was my real father. She didn't confirm it right away. Instead, she started talking about the past in this vague, roundabout way, how she'd been young, lonely, and made mistakes, how some mistakes had consequences you couldn't fix. I cut her off and told her I'd already done my own digging. I knew the man's name, his arrest history, and his connection to the bar fight. I told her I knew about the DNA test, the letters she'd kept from me, everything. Her eyes filled with tears then, but not the kind that fall. They just stayed there, brimming, as if she was fighting to keep them from spilling over. And finally, in barely more than a whisper, she said, "Yes, he's your father." The words hung between us like smoke. She admitted she'd been seeing him while she was still with the man I'd grown up believing was my dad. And yes, he'd been with her the night of the bar fight. She claimed she didn't know for sure if he was the one who killed that man, but she'd been terrified. He'd told her if she didn't back him up, she'd regret it. When I asked why she'd let someone else take the fall, she broke. She said she thought she was protecting me, that my biological father had threatened to take me away if she didn't keep quiet. I wanted to feel sympathy, but all I felt was cold. Then she said something that made my stomach twist. He's been trying to see you again. I stared at her, trying to process those words. She kept glancing over my shoulder, like she was afraid someone might overhear us, then leaned in and said he'd reached out to her a few weeks ago, claimed he wanted to make things right after all these years. She told me she hadn't agreed to meet him yet. She was scared of what he might say, or worse, what he might want from me, but then she admitted she'd kept the conversation going. Part of her, she said, still felt tied to him, even after everything. It hit me then that she'd been keeping this secret alive for decades, not because she thought it was best for me, but because she couldn't let go of him. I asked where he was now. She hesitated, then finally scribbled an address on a napkin. It was in a run-down part of town, the kind of place you don't wander into by accident. Before I could decide what to do with it, she grabbed my hand and said, "If you go there, don't tell him about the DNA. Don't tell him you know." I asked her why, and she looked at me with this hollow expression I'll never forget. "Because if he knows you're his, he'll never let you go." The words made my skin crawl. That night, I couldn't stop staring at the napkin. Every instinct screamed at me to burn it, to pretend none of this had happened. Instead, the next morning, I got in my car and drove to the address, and the man who opened the door looked at me like he'd been expecting me for years. He was older now, hair gone almost completely gray, but the resemblance was undeniable. Same eyes, same jawline, same faint scar above the brow that I'd noticed in the mugshot. For a moment, neither of us spoke. He just stared at me like I'd stepped out of a dream he'd been having for decades. Then he smiled, not the warm, fatherly kind of smile you'd expect in some movie reunion. This was sharper, calculated. He stepped back and motioned for me to come in, like he already knew I would. The apartment smelled of stale smoke and something faintly chemical. The blinds were drawn, and a muted TV flickered. On the table were 2 coffee cups. Only one was steaming. "You look just like her," he said, his voice low and almost amused. I didn't sit. I didn't smile. I just told him I knew who he was, that I wanted answers about that night, about my real dad, the one who'd raised me until prison took him. His smile faded. He leaned back, studying me, and for a long moment I thought he'd actually confess. Instead, he said, "Some things are better left buried. Your mother knew that. She still does." I told him I didn't care. I wanted the truth. That's when his eyes darkened, and he stepped closer. "Be careful what you dig up, kid. You might not like what you—" The way he said it wasn't a warning. It was a promise. I left without another word, my heart pounding, the napkin address still burning in my pocket. I knew then that whatever happened between the man who raised me and this stranger wasn't some tragic accident. It was bigger, uglier, and dangerous. And now I was part of it, whether I wanted to be or not.